All right, hello everyone. This is another edition of the Embodied Dialogue podcast. My name is Seth Dellinger, and I'm really happy to be talking today to Matt Zepelin. And Matt Zepelin, like myself, was a practicing Feldenkrais practitioner for a number of years, but these days actually works at Shambala Publications, where he's an editor, particularly of books related to Buddhism. Matt is a practicing Buddhist. And I reached out to him because also he wrote a really amazing history of somatics. And this was actually his PhD dissertation. And then more recently, you can get a little piece of that. Oh, he's got it there. And I've got a more recent book here on the Feldenkrais method, Learning Through Movement. This is, you can see the editors, Staffan, Elgelid, and Kresge. And Matt has a chapter in this book, which is entitled Science and Feldenkrais Method, Science and Spirituality, a Historical Perspective. So anything else you want to add just as a general introduction?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. No, I think that was great. And I guess I can just say Buddhist practice and somatics were totally intertwined for me. I actually came to Feldenkrais through friends I knew at the Zen community I was living at the time. And my Zen teacher there would talk about somatic practices he had done. So it's been all kind of interwoven from the get-go.
Right, right. And that word interwoven, I think that's like maybe the theme that could be what this conversation is about, because somatics itself, like, maybe be good to get just as a quick definition from you of what that means. But in your dissertation, you're talking about, you know, in the history of somatics, you're talking about prevailing ideas in science, in philosophy, different religious trends, and then you talk about the individuals and, you know, in that lineage and how their lives were affected by all these things. And then there's this whole back and forth discussion. That title of the chapter in the book, Science and Spirituality, we might say that somatics kind of threads the needle somewhere in between. Is that at least a way of beginning to understand what somatics is?
Yeah, I think because somatics, and no single somatic method in somatics as a field has yet to land with a lot of solidity in sort of the culture or public awareness. I mean, it certainly has a lot more than it used to, but so when I was writing my dissertation, I felt like there need to be reference points for this. Like if I wrote a dissertation that was a completely internal study of somatics, which is in some ways what I wanted to do, but I think it would be extraordinarily hard for people to understand who haven't gone through some kind of somatic training themselves, because of course, I was just writing there. I'm not giving people lessons or something. They had to relate to it totally through the writing. So I went about it, I guess, in two major ways. One was looking at individuals who are well-known somatics teachers like Moshe Feldenkrais, Matthias Alexander, Mabel Todd. I started with Thomas Hanna, of course. He was the person who really coined the term somatics in this meaning. And sort of working backward from them and seeing, you know, they didn't come up with all of this sui generis. They had teachers, their teachers had teachers, there were cultural movements that all of them were involved with. So I worked backward looking at lineages and where did all of this come from. But then, yes, I also looked at larger historical bodies of research around spirituality, science, important cultural phases, a lot in the 19th century, actually, in my dissertation, and spirituality and science, and the performing arts. I would say those three were the main, you know, non-somatic chunks of history that I felt like reflected light on the history of somatics and helped me understand its involvement with those things and what's distinct about it.
Yeah. And so you laid out kind of 5 like large themes that might help someone to understand what somatics is. So I thought I might just go through those a little bit. So the first thing you mentioned is autodidactic therapeutics. And many of the people in the history of somatics, even going back to, I think the first main person you talked about was this fellow Delsarte, who's, this is the late 19th century.
Delsarte was born around 1810, 1811, lived till the early 1870s. So really the mid 19th century, but then Delsartism, the school that he founded, really flowered in the late 19th century in France, and then in the United States, had a big impact on theater training and on silent movie training and stuff like that. But yeah, he was the first individual where I felt like it would be hard to understand this individual without a concept like somatics, because it doesn't fit neatly into
because what you write about is that he sort of takes a certain amount of theatrical training, but then at a certain point he's kind of like, this isn't getting me where I want to go, and he looks around and there isn't really a training that gets him where he wants to go. But he says, well, as an actor, I want to really, authentically portray people how they are. So he goes out and he starts watching people, and then, he starts experimenting. But then at a certain point, since there's no system, he's going to kind of invent a system. And like, I think you do a great job in your writing of kind of saying like, this part is, pretty cool, and this part might just be kind of a mishmash. Like he puts something together, and there's a creativity there. And yet, it is like this individual has a kind of a limited perspective of the world. He's making big generalizations, and yet he did it. He impacted people. And then you talked about even some of the more modern figures in somatics, they're looking back to what he did.
I think Delsarte is a great representative of the autodidactic piece and also the therapeutics piece, but maybe to a lesser degree because he was so focused on performance. At that time in the 19th century, there was a whole field called oratory. This was pre-radio, pre-television, so like the ability to speak loudly and entertainingly or convincingly to groups of people was a very valuable skill, related to the theater, but also separate. There were people who were orators who were not actors. And Delsarte, out of the kind of passion for it that you described, like he went to one of the premier theatrical training academies in Paris and felt like the system of training was crap. Basically, it was all imitation of the teachers and not drawn from life. So for instance, to make it more concrete, he was playing a role in a play in which the character he was playing needed to act surprised. And he was showing surprise the way he had been taught to do, which was very exaggerated. It was like, and then he observed a situation in actual life where someone was surprised. I'm dropping right now exactly what it was, but it was much more
I think
subtle.
You said something like his cousin unexpectedly arrived for a visit and he sort of noticed that he did a double take or something like this.
I'm forgetting the exact gestures he observed, but it was much more subtle and nuanced than the like, I'm blown back by this response. And he realized that empirical observation of how people's bodies move and their gestures in everyday life might be a more effective form of training than what he had picked up in school. So the autodidactic piece was he started observing people in daily life. He would go to parks and watch mothers with their children. He went to the morgue. What I noticed as I studied various figures in the 19th and 20th century, and of course Moshe is a great example of this, is that autodidacticism, that either from a place of despair at points from people who had a disease or an injury and were not getting helped by the medical authorities that they went to, or a place of creativity, maybe more on the performing arts side, or in Moshe's case, like his need to be effective in street fights, basically in British Palestine in his youth, like solving some pressing need that wasn't getting solved from the outside through autodidactic approaches. And most of the cases I saw were therapeutic. It was someone with a throat. Alexander had a terrible throat issue. He was an orator and it was compromising his career. Or Mabel Todd had a spinal injury, it sounds like, and she was working with that on her own. Feldenkrais, of course, had several major injuries to his knee and so forth. And then also all these people in the 19th century had neurasthenia, which is no longer like considered a medical condition today, but we might think about it as like severe somatically expressed anxiety or something like that. And how do you work with your own system there?
Yeah, I mean, that seems really relevant for the world we live in today, right? Like, you know, people have all kinds of just like, we might just say in modern expression, like hangups, and we don't know where they came from. I mean, at this point, we're almost drowning in different theories of like, you know, attachment theory of when we were growing up, or am I carrying a particular trauma, or how is this expressed? But what's also interesting to me is like this whole back and forth with mainstream culture, which of course has changed. So like another one of the main figures you talked about after Delsarte was Gustav Fechner. And here's a guy who is, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I just read over the past week or two your thesis, but it seems that he identified largely as a scientist, but he's also like in a point in time where there was no particular contradiction to be religious and to think that God sort of arranged the universe. And so he's got some of his writings that are about the afterlife and whatnot, but then he's also doing these experiments. And this is another one of the pieces that you mentioned as a sort of a general category in somatics, is you mentioned phenomenological practice methods. And poor Fechner, part of what he did is he stared at the sun a bunch, and but he did a thing together with another scientist, Weber, and they come up with the Weber-Fechner law, which for me as a Feldenkrais practitioner, and of course you know this, Feldenkrais would pick up on this later, and this has to do with this idea of just noticeable difference. Like if I'm carrying something heavy and you put a little weight on top, I don't notice it. But if you put the weight like right into my hand, I'm going to feel that. So there's something about the relationship between effort and my ability to tune in. And that to me is, you know, I have experienced it myself, right? And it makes sense to me on a very direct, experiential, physical, you know, level. And this is what I'm teaching clients. This is what many of the somatic practitioners are teaching people, is like, look, you got to slow down. You've got to notice more things, because more things kind of come out that we can sort of feel. And so this is like, I think, a contribution from Fechner that is really relevant and useful today. And yet there's so much of what he was doing then that we would sort of say, no, that's all nonsense to us now. So
I think Fechner is a good example of why you need to have some view of religion and science in order to really understand where somatics came from. Because yes, he was, I mean, a highly celebrated scientist in his day. Some people consider him the founder of experimental psychology, or among the most important founders of experimental psychology. You know, there had been a revolution in statistics basically in the early 19th century, or even a little bit in the 18th century, where scientists and you know, some of the people who were scientists at that time were not associated with institutions and so forth. They were just doing it on their own because they had the money and the interest. But people noticed things like that the number of murders every year in Paris remained the same, you know, or was trackable on a chart, or even within that the number of murders by particular methods like knife stabbings and drownings or whatever could be charted. and that actually you could probably predict how many people would die by drowning in Paris next year through this use of statistics. And so that it created an explosion of understanding the world through probability. And Fechner understood that. He was trained in that generation of scientists who could see that. So for instance, with what you were talking about, like the just noticeable difference, it's not that everyone has the same just noticeable difference, but if you measure the just noticeable difference in, say, weight perception for 1,000 people, you can see that this is not random. There's a clear, there will be a clear band in which the large majority of people fall, and then there are outliers, and you can map it on a bell curve. And suddenly it's not so like any one person's idiosyncrasies have a context to them. So that's the scientific piece that Fechner brought. And it was cool for me to learn how much phenomenology, like experimenting through your own experience, was a full part of science in the 19th century, not just Fechner, many other people.
Right.
But then, yeah, for sure, he was a very religious individual, as was Delsarte, as were other people who I write about in the dissertation. This was really before the separation between science and religion had become so formalized and widely accepted as, like, even if you are religious and scientific, like, these need to function as separate part of your minds, and most people aren't actually both things. We see that in the polarization in our culture on this topic. But at that time, yeah, Fechner and Delsarte also had no problem saying, like, I'm totally scientific, and everything I'm talking about is because of God's will being expressed in a certain way.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm glad you kind of just mentioned, what's going on today, because I want to get to that. And I think that, in case anyone listening is like, oh, this is some interesting history. In fact, I think that what you uncovered in your research is really helps us understand where we're at. And part of that is this question, because now at this point, at least in Western culture, for the most part, science and religion are supposed to stay away from each other. And yet there's something that science does for us, and there's something that religion does for us. And then, like we were even talking before we hit record, that the science for some people is the new religion, right? Like if it can't be proved, but of course, when you're talking about 1,000 different people doing this, same practice that Fechner came up with to figure out, well, we know in a colloquial way, we say, well, this person's really sensitive, or this person's not so sensitive. But what he's showing is, like, look, there's something about the human nervous system and our way of experiencing ourselves that if everyone goes through the following procedure, they can actually train their sensitivity in the direction of becoming more sensitive, and then having this sensitivity. And I'm actually, as I'm talking now, I'm probably talking more the language of Moshe Feldenkrais than Fechner. But it's a interesting thing, because there's what we might call invisible experience, like how it feels to be inside my body, how it feels to be me. No one else can see it. But when I'm talking right now, I'm trying to put it into words. I'm trying to give you a sense of my experience. And so this is already like jumping ahead a little bit, but like this is like even just us talking or talking about our experience. This could be, the field of psychology or talk therapy. But somatics is doing something different.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way that I would look at that in a historical sense is, like, at the time of someone like Fechner, and I actually think Feldenkrais still to some degree, definitely FM Alexander was this way. They were operating with like a psychical materialist dualism. So they're saying, like, okay, here's your mind and here's your body. You can look at it from either side. You can look at it through the body, or excuse me, through the mind at the side of experience and understand the body. You can look at it through the material of the body and understand the mind, or Fechner or Delsarte might have said the soul. But what was what was very modernist about this is they thought this is all a perfectly unified whole. Like maybe you and I as individuals can't understand it, but God understands it, and humanity's knowledge will progress to the point where we do understand it. So it doesn't matter if I can say exactly which physical substrate causes exactly which internal experience right now. Eventually we'll know, and it's all unified in the mind of God anyway. Mm-hmm. Over time, with postmodernism, I think it's become much harder to have confidence in that assertion. You know, if you don't believe in God, or you believe in God but don't know what that means, it's much harder to say that all of this fits together neatly in one puzzle, as opposed to maybe saying there are infinite viewpoints about phenomena and you can try different ones out. But as far as science went, science, you know, in the 20th century put all of its money on the materialist side. You know, it's really like the idea of studying through your own experience got relegated to psychotherapy, you know, still with religion or spirituality. But that's part of why I found it so exciting to find these scientists who had not yet, and William James is probably the best example of this, so had not yet abandoned experience as a proper field of study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, William James was another one of the figures that you pointed to as someone who really connected, I guess, some of these earlier figures. You mentioned Feldenkrais, Mabel, Todd, and one other person as sort of looking to him. And then, but maybe another piece that I thought was really interesting we should miss is like the experience of William James' sister, because in the, I guess it was late 19th century, or maybe, well, you're going to have to help me with the dates again.
Late 19th.
But like, well, let me just let you explain, since I'm fumbling all over. But there's three cures that you talked about. There's the rest cure, the water cure, and the movement cure. What were these cures? And could you say a little bit about like what those cures also said about just where mainstream culture was in terms of health of mind and body?
Yeah, that was really fun to do that research and write about. Also tragic to see. So William James's sister was named Alice James, and she was a brilliant individual. Many people feel that her capacity as a writer rivaled William, and also Henry James was one of her other brothers, the famous novelist. But she was completely debilitated from a young age by what they called neurasthenia. So she had depression. She was haunted by suicidal and also patricidal thoughts. She would think about killing her father all the time, while, you know, she had to live with him most of her life. And so for men and women, but especially women in the mid 19th century, and we're especially talking about white upper middle class or upper class women, neurasthenia was unbelievably common. And so there were, and in many cases it was debilitating, in some cases even fatal. People would stop eating or be confined to asylums. A lot of early psychoanalysis in Europe came out of trying to understand neurasthenia and treating it. But didn't
you also say at a certain point that this is a kind of a catch-all phrase, this neurasthenia? I mean, when I was reading, I'm also just getting the sense of like so much of what we understand today about mental health was just unknown. And there was, I mean, it seemed like a production of the culture, and especially the experience of women, which is part of what this label was pointing to.
Yeah, I mean, as much as people complain today about like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual like having too big of categories, like back then there were, you know, many fewer categories for doctors to use at all. So neurasthenia was a gigantic grab bag of symptoms and treatments for them. It also came out, neurasthenia was actually the later term for what had earlier been called hysteria. And you know, of course, there's a association with women. The word hysteria is actually, if I'm remembering correctly, it's from the Greek for uterus, and there were these there are these theories that a woman's uterus would move around her body in unstable ways, and that was actually the physical substrate causing all of the mental anguish.
And this was the science of the day.
This was the science of the day. And
right.
but yeah, so getting back to Alice James, she came from a wealthy family, so she was able to try different cures. I don't remember if she tried the water cure, but it was, I think, Catherine Beecher, the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who became a big physical culture proponent and teacher. I was reading her account of doing the water cure, and this was this incredible regimen of like getting up early in the morning, taking a cold water shower, drinking a ton of cold water, maybe going for a walk, again, just getting doused with cold water for 10, 15 minutes, getting wrapped in wet bandages, drinking more water. So, they were basically looking for ways, like what's a mind-body intervention that will be effective on such a tenacious and ambiguous condition as neurasthenia seemed to be. The other ones we mentioned, probably the saddest one is the rest cure,
right.
which in its benign forms in some ways sounds good to me. Probably a lot of us could use this now. It's basically like go to a house in the country, stay in bed for a couple of weeks, eat a bunch of nutritious food and get massages. Probably that worked for a lot of people, actually, if your main problem was exhaustion or lack of attention or something. But the dark side of it is that this was coercively employed on many women whose underlying problem was actually a lack of avenues to express themselves in their lives. They were already too hemmed in by the gender norms and lack of professional options and social roles in the 19th century. And then from that condition of already being too, I think claustrophobically tied down to certain narrow spaces, they were further confined to, basically locked in a bedroom and told not to move very much throughout the day.
And one of the doctors you quoted basically said, like, look, the problem that these women are having is too much education and too much intellectual engagement, and so that needs to stop.
Yeah.
But then later, when you talk about, let's see, you mentioned Annie Payson Call, Genevieve Gibbins, and later Mabel Todd, some of the women who were pioneers of somatic methods. Of course, part of the story of what they came up with was that they also had to share their discoveries with the world as women in a society where, like they were already at a disadvantage because of their gender. And so this kind of, in a certain way, loops back to this a little bit, maybe the question of the autodidactic therapeutics, but also something I hadn't mentioned yet, but you gave as another category around somatics, is just a tendency towards syncretism, which I think I understand by syncretism, you just mean like drawing on many different fields and putting them together.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, to wrap up the thread about the women's piece in the late 19th century, that one of the books that I read was referred to, the subtitle was like The Quiet Victory of Professional Women in the late 19th century. And I think the ambiguity around mind-body practices, like what is that, what is it for? Some women, again, probably mostly women coming from a upper middle class or upper class background to begin with, and white women, realize like, oh, there's a space for me to inhabit as a professional there. Like I can teach groups of other women the physical culture techniques, or, is it about health? Is it about, oratory? Is it just about comportment as an upper class woman? And they really were, in some cases, internationally able to carve out careers, get to know, well-known people, make money. So that was, the real redemptive piece of that history, is seeing these incredible women who are every bit as much the founders of somatics as Feldenkrais or Alexander. I mean, you look at someone like Genevieve Gibbins, for instance, who came out of the Delsarte movement, became an international teacher, published books, made her own life really I see no reason to consider her as like less of a founder of somatics than some people who are better known and a little bit more recent.
Right.
Yeah, and to address the syncretism piece, I think the way I would put that, the way I think about that now is just like, if somatics is about the phenomenology of your own experience, like everyone's experience is unique. People are going to find different emphases within that. People have different values and concerns that they're starting with. People's physical experience is very different, you know, even just as simple as a tall person and a short person, like they're going to have different experiences of their own bodies. And so I think it's not surprising that then when somatics people try to talk about what it is, it's going to feel syncretic. It's pulling from here and there. Right. Even Moshe Feldenkrais by himself, like he's pulling from Hasidic Judaism and Japanese martial arts and physics and Gurdjieff, you know, like that's very syncretic within one individual's presentation of somatics.
Right. I've heard some people sometimes say the Feldenkrais method. That word method is kind of a funny word because it's like, well, it's this really, you know, brilliant guy who spent decades like pulling together all this stuff. And I mean, I think on the other hand, there is a good argument for the word method because awareness through movement, as you know, there's thousands of different awareness through movement lessons. They're very diverse, but they all do take a certain form. They involve slowing down. They often involve lying on the ground in order to reduce the muscular work that we do upright in gravity, although of course there are those lessons that are done upright. You move and then you rest, you know, and then you use the rest time to observe what's happening. And so there's a certain kind of a form where, you know, I think like an analogy that's sometimes made is like, if you think about jazz and you think about the song forms, and then, you know, a musician comes along and they can play the same song, but they can add new arrangement, or they can change the rhythm or do something with it. And like you and I, when we were teaching, I still teach, you were teaching before, but teaching awareness through movement, there's a certain creativity on the part of the practitioner that's available. And the other thing that was interesting for me in reading your thesis is also just like reflecting on my own experience. Like I've done all kinds of things in my life, you know, as a confused modern human, where I try something out and I'm like, wow, that really worked. And then it's like, well, what was that? How do I, like before I found Feldenkrais, I had gotten interested in breath, and I was reading some things about breath, and I was also running. So I paid attention to the chapter in the book was like breathing for runners, you know, and it said something about when you're running, you know, your feet are like the metronome, breathe in for this many paces, then breathe out, do it different, you know, use this particular combination. If it's an uphill, do it this way. But I had a musical background. So I was running and counting all kinds of various number patterns that I just thought were interesting and creating these problems for my respiratory system while I was running, but figuring it out. And then I had this really great experience of feeling like really good after the run, like even more than usual. And I was like, whoa, what was that? And like, what do I do with that? Who should I tell about this? And then when I found Feldenkrais, I was like, oh, this awareness through movement thing, it's kind of similar. It's like you do a little experiment on yourself almost. And just before I throw it back to you, I think because what you wrote, there's a kind of a tension where the autodidactic thing, it's like we could take it too far and we could just have this experience in that and think we can generalize them all over the place. And yet there's these people like Feldenkrais who really did put together, yes, personal experiences, but then created a practice, worked with many people, refined it, and made a real contribution to the culture. So, yeah, I had one, I kind of lost part of the train of thought there, but there's a, well, what do you make of this sort of tension between the individual experience and, this is what I wanted to say. Feldenkrais is one of his maxims that we all learned in the training was to correct is incorrect, right? There's this way that, like I'll see clients all the time that they'll come in and then they'll sort of try to sit properly because they're with this movement person. And often it's those cultural ideas of what's correct that are causing people. I mean, if we go back to the rest cure, like that cultural idea was really messing people up. And so it's often the people who do something a little countercultural, actually, who maybe make a discovery of real value.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to say I'm glad you brought up the analogy to music, because one of the ways that crystallized Feldenkrais' contribution in my mind was I just imagining like a composer, a music composer who wrote like 1,500 distinct scores and another 1,000 variations on those scores. And, when you think about it that way in the more familiar category of like music composition, it's like, that's an incredible that's a prolific output, and that's one way to think about what Moshe did in a very public sense, is he left us 1,500 or 2,000 distinct embodiment scores, that you can try out, that people can teach in their own ways, that they can, whether it's trying to play it really carefully according to the words as you inherit them, or really improvise on it or whatever. So totally, that's very that's a public output of his phenomenological exploration, which is an incredible, and very unique gift. But yeah, so to address the tension that you brought up, on the one hand, if somatics is a kind of phenomenology, it's a kind of study of your own experience, or as Thomas Hanna put it, like somatics is the study of embodiment from the inside. What does it mean to be a body from the inside? And any external ideas are meant to feed the internal study, not so much vice versa. There's no reason that has to be public at all. It's perfectly fine for someone to be, whether they consider it just for their health, or it helps them at their job, or it's a spiritual practice, that can be entirely private and idiosyncratic. And of course, it's so nonverbal, much of it will never be communicated anyway. You can't, you get a subtle passing emotional somatic feeling as you do something. Maybe that will necessarily always remain private to you. Maybe you don't understand it yourself. And then on the other side, there's, I think it especially comes into play for those of us who are trying to do somatics work professionally. It has to become verbal, it has to become conceptual, it has to become teachable. And, I think there's inevitably a tension there around guiding someone toward their idiosyncratic mind-body experience, but doing it in a way that's public. And for better or worse, I think for worse, in terms of how hard it is to make a living doing this kind of thing, we don't have cultural categories in Western culture that neatly allow that kind of coming together of two people. Like you and I were talking before this around the category of psychotherapy is normative. It's been around for a long time. It's had a lot of cultural success. So the idea of two people sitting together in a room and talking, that's fine. There can be idiosyncratic experience that comes out of that, but it's in a container that makes sense to people. Insurance companies will even pay for it in certain contexts. Whereas somatic work, two people get together, one of them lies down and the other one moves them and helps them move in this way that has a lot to do with personal goals and undefined inner experience. We don't have a cultural container for that that's very strong. And yeah, so, there's a lot of room for creativity there, but it also makes it, very difficult. And the start of my chapter in that book talks about I think all Feldenkrais practitioners have had the experience of it's really hard to interest people in this work when they have no reference point for it, going into that conversation.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a little piece, and this connects to just so we kind of catch all. The fifth and final category that you mentioned was modern secular esotericism, And again,
Yeah.
I was looking up all kinds of words when I was reading. But esotericism, you mentioned Gurdjieff earlier, who was an influence on Feldenkrais. But I guess esotericism, technically speaking, is like some sort of practice where basically you have to be some sort of initiate to know about it. But even being a somatics practitioner can feel like that because, like a lot of the people don't necessarily know about it. But in terms of the culture, you this chapter of yours on the Feldenkrais method, science and spirituality, you have this line that I found interesting. You said, "I use the word spirituality to indicate the practices and experiences of people who embrace secularism as an opportunity for creative blending." And a little further down, you give just the example of how many, like in our culture, you're going to run into people of all kinds of different religions and backgrounds. There's a lot more kind of mixing than maybe would have been the case at a certain point in the past. And you also say, "What I mean by secularism, however, is that whatever one's personal belief system, we live in an era where the majority of people in the world are unavoidably confronted with people who have different religious beliefs, including all varieties of agnosticism and atheism." And so, like, if we try to, put somatics into the world today, there is just like this real kind of lack of a common vocabulary that's out there. I mentioned I've had some discussions with John Vervaeke, who's both a cognitive scientist, a philosopher, and meditation teacher involved with Tai Chi, and he talks about what he calls the meaning crisis. And one of the key things that he talks about is sort of like what religion used to provide that it no longer provides. It's like, the largest category, I think, demographically for religion in the United States is the nuns, N-O-N-E. No religion, right? And I put myself in that category. Interestingly, you said that somatics, the Feldenkrais method included, might help someone to have a spiritual experience, maybe just because of the they develop more of an ability to sort of feel a connection between what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling in my body, and what's going on in the environment around me. That's not yet an idea of God, but it might actually take me closer to some sort of universal kind of connection.
I mean, so just to say a few words about esotericism, because it's not a well-known historical phenomenon, or people know the word esoteric as meaning kind of secret, but there's the initiatory piece that you mentioned. Like, usually to enter an esoteric lineage or practice, you need to be initiated by a teacher and maybe even form like a student-disciple relationship. And then the secret part in esoteric teachings, I like the Tibetan term for it, which is like self-secret or self-concealed, which means that like it's not actually the thing that's secret, it's that you as the practitioner have to transform to the point where you can observe what is there, so it's like, and it depends, like even in those Tibetan teachings, you do often have to get an initiation to be able to get the teaching. They won't let you see it. But the thought is like, actually even a non-initiate could see the teaching and wouldn't understand it because it's self-concealed. And I think probably most people who have been through a Feldenkrais method training have an experience like that, where it's like, someone lies on their back and does very subtle movements for 30 minutes. And certain people are having experiences of ecstatic liberation or catharsis or finding new capacities. And other people are experiencing very little. Like, I don't, I barely noticed. I fell asleep. Like so I do think there's something about somatics that has that quality. I know when I first joined, I even had the intuition, like the best way for me to learn this would just be to find one teacher and study with them one-on-one. And then just the economics don't work for that usually. Like,
but that too, I mean, if we go back to Delsarte and do that form of education would have been more prevalent in the past for someone work with a single teacher in that way. And that's kind
Yeah.
of missing now.
Yeah. But yeah, I do think, like, in terms of spirituality, I mean, I'll just nerd out on a little history real fast because I find it so interesting. But the idea that the history that clued me into this idea of secularism as not anti-religion or no religion, but many religions all in the same space, and then atheism and agnosticism also in that space. It was work on the Protestant Revolution in Europe, where basically this historian, Owen something, dropping his name, talked about how Europe evolved from a place where Catholicism was everyone's religion, and there was awareness, and there were Jews and travelers, there were Muslims mostly along the borders of Europe. But once the Protestant Revolution occurred and took place, now everyone, that's exaggerating, but people had a choice, like, are you this or are you that? And how do these two things relate to each other? And then Protestantism, schismed and fragmented and developed into many, many different versions, and Catholicism was reacting to those versions. And so suddenly there was a field of choice and thought about it. And by the time you reach all the way to the mid 20th century in the West, that's become highly globalized. People are aware of and meet other people from not only many different Christian faiths, Judaism, but also non-Abrahamic faiths, Eastern religions. People are aware of indigenous religions. And so I think for many, many people in our culture, there's a kind of disorientation to all of this traditional religion, at the same time that, because of all the technological and work-related things that have happened, we've become very, very disembodied, very conceptual.
Yep. Right.
So I do see somatics, not like everyone who practices somatics will suddenly become spiritual, but it's a really direct route to something that's more grounded, embodied, concrete, sensory, for someone to experience, awareness and to just see what happens if you are in touch with your body and you're experiencing awareness with your surroundings. It may be that a person who before had vague or no experiences of spirituality suddenly feels like, oh, I have access to this. Life is a spiritual experience, as well as these other kinds of experiences that I'm more familiar with.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, in my life, I had a sense at a certain point, I was essentially raised.
Excuse me, I'm just gonna stand up.
Oh, sure. No
Sorry,
worries.
go ahead.
And what you were talking about with the Protestant Revolution and then the idea that here's this category that I could choose to put in myself into. This is just the question of belonging, right? And connection to others. I think this is one of the big pieces what Vervaeke's talking about when, so many people don't really have a sense of religion. Like, I can't imagine converting to any of the organized religions of today, but I know that in my life, it's become a lot more important to me to find connection to something greater than myself. And yet I'm not exactly sure how to define that, because what is it? And so, but I'm curious, because part of the idea of what I'm getting from talking to you is that somatics is maybe a practice that it can help us as individuals who, all of us, as you pointed out, are idiosyncratic on some level. No one grew up in the same family, neighborhood, at school, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of have to work all of that out. But there's a fair amount of the human experience that we share in common that I can do this practice that works for many other people. And I think if I can learn to use the practice, not so much as like, Feldenkrais will get me this, but there's just the sort of like, even the Socratic idea of like, know thyself. This is like understanding who I am, how I work, how this body of mine responds, in these different situations. Even just this basic sense of like becoming really good at self-observation. But then to think that maybe somatics is like a full program for meaning in life, maybe that's going to fall a little short. I mean, this is one of the pieces you pointed out, was that Feldenkrais and a number of the somatic practitioners, they had a kind of a utopian idea about evolution. Like, we can just like really figure out how we humans work, and then we can just kind of speed up evolution, and evolution's just, we just get better and better and better, and kind of that could be problematic.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about it. I mean, on the one hand, like Alexander, for instance, was more overtly that way than Feldenkrais. You know, he referred to conscious control and the directing of evolution. And the fact that he was doing those writings at the same time that the eugenics movement was so popular, it just gives it an eerie cast, you know, like, we really want to be talking about directing evolution while there's also so much racism and public discussion about sterilizing people with disabilities and stuff like that. There's some dark stuff to the entire progressive world in the early 20th century. And on the other hand, you know, when people, not just somatics people, but all kinds of spiritual teachers and social activists say stuff like, you know, if we could just get everybody to slow down, calm down, get more in touch with themselves, act, you know, find out what their values are and how to access them and act from them, like, wouldn't we have a better world? I feel like, yes, actually that's true. And when you see how poorly the political system responds to, like, for instance, widely desired changes like better healthcare, like acting on climate change, and the political system just hits gridlock as soon as there's any agency, you know, as there's any movement in that direction, you do start to wonder, you know, like Greta Thunberg, for instance, in relation to climate change, has started saying, like, it's just not going to come from the political system. It has to come from people deciding to change their lives and acting together, because, you know, the co-optation of pro-climate rhetoric by politicians and corporations who are actually doing nothing, you know, that's even worse than it was before. Like, now it appears that they're doing something, but they're doing nothing. So anyway, that's going off on a tangent, but it's like, I don't want to give up on the optimism of the transformative capacity of somatics, but I also, I think, especially when you combine it with the fact, or my observation, that many people in different somatic schools are overly focused on the founder of their school, you know, and think like, this person was the most unique genius in the history of mind-body methods or whatever. It comes across as provincial. It's like, oh yeah, like, you don't even know about all these other people who that person you're talking about saw as influential and formative. It's important, I think, to broaden out and see, like, we all have minds and bodies, we can all experiment with them, and we can learn from different sources. It doesn't mean not maybe having one lineage or source as your primary influence and really going deep with that. I think that's important, but I think for somatics, like, more joining and less competitive contrasting might be good for all the different, you know, lineages and schools.
Right. Well, you mentioned at the end of your dissertation that, you know, many somatic practitioners, essentially what they know is about the founder of the school that they're in. And this larger context that you put together is not really there. And I mean, it also just occurs to me that, like there's, some people will joke, there's, you know, the bumper stickers, what would Jesus do? And like, in the Feldenkrais community, there's often this kind of question of, like, us practitioners, you know, I mean, Feldenkrais died in 1984, and then there'll be these sort of debates over the purity of what a particular practitioner is. Like, is this still Feldenkrais? And it's like, and then the response that I sometimes heard was like, what would Feldenkrais do? It's like, well, I think if what Feldenkrais would do is he would continue to be really curious about everything that was going on around him, and continue to, like, try to, you know, so is this kind of like, if anything, the tradition, as I understand it, with somatics is about innovation. And of course, this is not the time of Fechner, like, we really do have science and religion put so if we
Yeah.
experiment or we try some technique, some somatic idea, or we read some book, that was put out by a cognitive scientist last year, and we say, oh, wow, this is cool. I think I can pull this all together. Like maybe we're less likely to assume that, like we've just learned something spiritual, but who knows? Like, it's kind of like there's still, anyway, it's just like today there are so many streams of information, so many schools of thought, and yet I think we also face, as you were talking about in terms of the polarization, we face a very unique world where maybe it's not neurasthenia that we're all suffering from, but we're all suffering from like information overload or this kind of like these cloistered communities where we only talk to people who think the way we do. And so I guess to throw this all back at you, like what do you see as like the role of somatics now, or potentially the role of somatics now?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of responses to that. Like I'll do the big one and then the small one. And the small one is hopefully, if there are Feldenkrais method or other somatics practitioners listening, will be the more practical piece. But the big piece is like there are major movements in our culture that are making space for things like somatics. I think the most important one is mindfulness. Mindfulness as a movement has developed a lot now, really since the 1990s, but there have been thousands of scientific studies of the effects of mindfulness. There are mindfulness institutes and research centers. I'm talking about secular mindfulness, I mean, it's all derived from Buddhism by and large, but not Buddhist institutions. And there's research centers, there's studies, there's activity, there are massive teacher training programs in mindfulness. So like for people who are comfortable doing so, and this is what I did in the latter part of my practice, like using mindfulness as a way to introduce somatics, it may make it easier, like I, for instance, I taught a one-day workshop with a friend of mine who's a mindfulness teacher. And instead of what he would usually do, which is like adding some yoga or Tai Chi in, we did 2 ATMs. And he told me like, that was the most effective embodiment component to a mindfulness training that I've ever done. It was fantastic for the students. Another one, which is more recent, like another way that I think somatics can join with a more powerful element of the culture is social justice. So probably some listeners have read like Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, or there's a lot of people around him and others. I think there's an institute even in Minneapolis around this, which is basically looking at problems of discrimination, especially racism, but it could be anyone, and saying like, if people don't have access to their own bodies, and what we're talking about is intergenerational social trauma, like, I'm a white person, but I don't have any personal experience of slavery or of Jim Crow, and yet those parts of our history have landed in my conditioning. I've got to have access to my body to notice like, oh, a Black person, a person of color entered the room and I tensed up. I felt afraid, and so somatics can be an incredible training for people to feel like, oh, this is happening to me at this embodied level, and I need to learn about my embodiment in order to be either change myself or be an effective social justice activist who doesn't get totally caught up in heady anger and burnout. And then the last piece I would say in terms of, I think your question was, what role does somatics have to play in the culture? This will connect to the small piece, which is just like every individual who's committed to this can hustle. And, that's the word you and I were using when we got on. It's like, we do live in a culture that is still very comfortable with mind-body dualism, very comfortable that you go to the doctor and the doctor acts as if you are not the person who is your body. It's like, it's a totally external view of what your problems might be. And so it's going to take hustle to make niches within that. The one that I adopted for several years was Parkinson's disease. I felt like with all the money and all the mainstream treatments that are available for Parkinson's, there was a huge gap in my perception in terms of addressing Parkinson's folks as embodied human beings and really getting them to study what is this experience from the inside, what's better, what's worse, what rhythms work well for me. That was going great. It was very satisfying. And then just from a financial perspective, I had student loan debt and the rate at which I was making money was too slow. So when I had a job offer to become an editor, I decided to take it. But yeah, I really think like there's a space in our culture for hustle. And the hard part of that is like practitioners may need to spend half or 75% of their time on marketing for a while, for years, in order to really make the space in which you can do this transformative work with a volume of people that you need to work on in order to become a master at what you're doing. And that's like when I look at Moshe Feldenkrais, or also when I look at a lot of the baby boomer practitioners who have become successes, what I see is that they got a very high volume of people coming to see them over a period of 10, 15 years. And it may be different now. How you get those people may be different now for us than it was for them. The culture has changed. It's not the 1970s. Moshe's world is a totally different world than what most of us are living in. And so I think people have to negotiate that tension individually around like how much am I willing to hustle and where are my integrity boundaries of like I will do a lot of things to promote my practice, but I won't pass that boundary because that's just going to lead to burnout.
Yeah. Well, just kind of a couple last thoughts. I know probably wrap up pretty soon, but when you were talking about some of the different situations in our culture and, that moment where something happens, whether it's, because of the relations between the races, or it's just my experience in my family or whatever it is, that moment of tensing up that you talk about, like that's a moment where we lose autonomy. And this was my sense of like, one of Feldenkrais's big things was like, this is how you take back control of your own autonomy. And yet in the history, and I think it's what you're talking about today with this sense of, practitioners feeling like they need to hustle, but it also goes back like, I think it was FM Alexander had this whole lawsuit where he was literally formally accused of being a quack, right? Even while he was, you had a person like John Dewey, this really, respected educator, philosopher, who goes to Alexander and says, wow, I was completely intellectually humiliated by this person who showed me like, that in an embodied way, I didn't hardly knew anything about what I was doing. And yet it is so far outside of the mainstream. And then of course, since the human potential movement of what's called New Age spirituality, like there's probably people out there that you and I would also call quacks. I mean, there's this marketplace and there's opportunism. So yeah, it's but I think that what happens, in that moment of tensing, what we're doing is we're defaulting somehow to someone else's morals that they taught us, or someone else's just dictum about how things are supposed to be. And then that moment of slowing down is an opportunity to just feel like, what's going on with me right now? And it's a place where we can come back to choice, which I think is also where we can come back to really relating to each other in a way that seems to be falling apart now.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I support that. And I don't see that. I mean, I'm a pretty left-wing person, but I don't see that. I don't see this as a left-right problem. I think people on all parts of the political spectrum, it's an equal opportunity disembodiment, So it's really, really good for people to learn to get in touch with their bodies. If there's trauma, it may need to happen very slowly. Like if someone who's been, chronically or severely traumatized and may even need a trauma-informed somatics practitioner to do that work, but to learn how to get in touch with your body so that you can start to differentiate, like, when do I feel unsafe and when are the external conditions actually unsafe? When am I too far forward? When am I too far back in relation to the situation? I just think that's transformative on the individual level. And, I'm a bit of a pessimistic person, but I'll just say it can't hurt on the social level, right? Like,
sure. Well, I mean, if your viewpoint is totally different than mine, and we're going to have like a civil conversation, it would seem like that one of the really basic prerequisites is that we can be comfortable in our bodies, that we can't be raring to fight every time you use that phrase that, sends me, or maybe you use that phrase and it does do something to me, but I'm able to go, oh, okay, he's using that buzzword I don't like, but then I can actually come back to my breath, feel my feet on the ground, just simple things like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And and I hope it continues to spread, and I think it will. We live in an age of anxiety. I mean, with social unrest and with climate change, it's like, I think, I look forward to younger people getting older and having the worldview of, like, climate change, for instance, is not an issue. Like, it's our entire world. Like, we have to deal with this, and the need to process grief, process difficult emotions, process anger, stay embodied, not burn out. Like, all of that is just going to continue to be as or more pertinent as it is now. So I think anyone who's trying to do this work, trying to spread it in the culture within the boundaries of what feels right for them, I support that. I encourage that. The last thing I'll say is I took a lot of encouragement from some of the historical figures I studied, because it's like, especially some of those women we talked about, it's like, you're operating in a culture in which you're supposed to be doing nothing and to not only not do nothing, but to pioneer a somatic method and spread it to students and teach it internationally. Like, those are a lot higher odds stacked against them than, just having a very noisy marketplace and a lot of competition. Like, they persevered. And so I really applaud anyone who's doing that.
Yeah, great. Well, this was fantastic, Matt. I think it was several years since we talked. But really good to reconnect.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, likewise.
Any particular things we talked about? Maybe your dissertation, we could actually put a link if anyone wants to go and check it out. Let people know where they could get a copy of this book that has your chapter in it. Anything else you'd like to make available to people who listen to the podcast today?
Thanks for that opportunity. I posted my dissertation on academia.edu, so we can provide that link. I don't know if you need to have an account or not to get there, but if you do, it's free anyway. So, otherwise, maybe we could post my personal website in there as well. Cool. And I'm happy to be in touch if anyone wants to, nerd out on history of somatics a little bit with me.
Awesome. Well, I enjoyed doing that with you today.
All right. Thanks so much, Seth.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt.